BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words. Those taking part are Anne Scott James, Denis Norden, Dilys Powell, and Frank Muir. And we go straight into round one. This attempts to test their vocabulary, and they get 2 marks if they give me the meaning of the following words approximately right. We begin with Anne Scott James. Anne, what is a Palafitte?
It sounds rather medieval.
It's earlier than that.
Early evil.
Well, it can't be Greek and it can't be Latin. I think it's an Arabian court.
That's not awfully bad. I give it half a mark. It's a prehistoric hut built on piles over a lake. But it was used to describe these curious lake villages, which in prehistoric times used to be built on lakes in Switzerland and northern Italy, called Palafitte. Now, Frank Muir, what is a Spey wife?
It's a Scottish mistress.
That's not a bad
When my
shot.
wife's away, I have a Spey wife.
It's not at all a bad shot, Frank. We haven't quite got there.
Not at all a bad shot. If it's an outer, I'll stick.
What does this particular kind of Spey wife do? And what's her trade or occupation, mainly?
Fisherwoman?
No, she'd have a column in the popular press at the moment.
Oh! Does she say sooth?
Yes.
She's a soothsayer.
Yeah, 1 out of 2. I give it an awful lot of help. A Spey wife is a female fortune teller, and it comes from a Scandinavian word, spey, which means to prophesy or to foretell, which we are alleged to get in horoscopes and things. Now, Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is a besetment?
It's a condition of being beset.
Yes, and what's that mean?
Oh, being hedged about by enemies and difficult people.
That'll do. It's one of the 2 answers. You haven't got...
It's one.
I think I'm going to give you 1.5 unless you give me the other one.
Must be another... Oh, it's a way of sort of arranging things.
1.5. It can be being hemmed in, sort of don't fence me in, that kind of thing. But it's usually a bit the same as a besetting sin. That is a sin that you carry around with you the whole time. You're beset with it, which again comes from an Old English word. The thing that most frequently tempts you and you find it hardest to resist. 1.5, I think, would be fair. Denis Norden, what is a standpatter?
It's an American term, I think.
Yes.
It's a political term for somebody who doesn't change his opinions at all. There's another very good word for that, which is a mumpsissimus.
You beat me entirely on that one, Denis. I've never heard of it. But you're quite right. In America, a standpatter is a politician who is all for strict adherence to his party line, the party platform. It is originally, especially apparently, on tariffs. And as Denis quite rightly says, he stands pat on that, which is the same as if you're playing poker in America, which means that you stick to the hand which you've been dealt and don't ask for extra cards. Before we begin round 2, I shall give each team a question which they can write down. And then I want the 2 women members of the teams to study that question, because at the end of the programme, I shall ask for an answer. Your question, Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, is, can you tell me the name of the book in which these characters appear? Smike, Newman Noggs, Crummles. And Anne Scott James and Denis Norden, your question is, who wrote, "The best things carried to excess are wrong"? And at the end of the programme, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these came to be said or written. Well, from now on, all the questions concern Charles Dickens in one way or another. And first, we have a round of quotations from his works. For 2 marks, I want the title of the books from which they're taken, and as a bonus mark, if you know the character concerned. Anne Scott James. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favour of 2.
Oh, Nicholas Nickleby. Mr. Squares.
Well done. 3 marks. Frank Muir, you don't object to an aged parent, I hope?
The faintest idea.
Great Expectations.
Great Expectations. A character called Mr. Wemmick said it to Pip because he was always talking about his old father when we had a round with him, who was always called either aged parent or aged P, and that's it. Now, Dilys Powell, I am well aware that I am the umblest person going. My mother is likewise a very humble person. We live in a numble abode.
Uriah Heep.
That's all right. And in which novel?
David Copperfield.
Well done. 3 marks. Denis Norden, Sairey, sech is life, which likewise is the hend of all things.
Yes. Sairey would be Sarah Gamp.
Yes?
From M. Chuzzlewit.
Yes, absolutely right. You get your 3 marks. It was said, according to Mrs. Sarah Gamp, who was an inveterate romancer, to her by her imaginary and quite non-existent friend who was called Mrs. Harris. And now a round of general questions about Charles Dickens. 2 marks again. Anne Scott James. He died in 1870. In what rather famous year was he born?
1815.
Nearly.
14. 1814.
Overtures to you.
Over 1812.
1812, yes.
1 out of 2. 1812, the year of Moscow and the year of the Great Overture. 1812. Frank Muir. He collaborated in some magazine stories with the first English mystery writer who dealt with detection of crime. Who was that writer, and what was his famous mystery?
The father of the English detective novel
Yes.
is Wilkie Collins.
Quite right.
Or we thought it was. It is.
Yes.
And it's either the Moonstone or Woman in White.
Woman in White is it.
Woman in
done.
White.
I think you deserve that. You get your 2 marks. Dilys Powell, in what novel does Dickens reflect his own early life?
David Copperfield.
And in what way does he reflect it?
Where he describes his childhood, where he was employed in the novel in a blacking factory. And his father was a character who, according to the novel, who said if you have an income of £1 and you spend 19 and 11 halfpenny, you're okay, but if you spend £1 and a halfpenny, you're not okay.
Yeah, roughly. It's not quite the words you use, but the sense is right. Yes, I think that's good enough. David Copperfield is the most autobiographical of all Dickens's novels, and he said after he'd written it, of all my books, I like this the best. And lots of the things that he describes David Copperfield as experiencing happened, or very like it, in his own childhood. 2 marks. Denis Norden, what was the first publication that made him a success and gave him a measure of financial security?
I would think it was the one that everybody queued up for when it was published in monthly parts.
That's right.
Which was the Pickwick Papers.
Quite right. Yep. More Charles Dickens, and in this round, the compiler has had the audacity to versify his questions, presumably to make them a bit more difficult. So for 3 marks this time, can you answer the following? Anne Scott James, 2 great Dickens characters, father and son, designed and created for laughter and fun. The father was plump, while his offspring was bony. The son's name was and the father's was
You see, stands for one name.
What's the line
Double
before?
The father was
Bony.
plump, while his offspring was bony.
Bony.
The
The
son's...
son's name
Yes,
was Sam.
The son was Sam Weller, the father was Tony.
that's right. That'll do. These are the Sam and Tony Weller, father and son, in Pickwick Papers. 3 marks it is. Frank Muir, the fans of Charles Dickens cried 10,000 pities that the hero should die in A Tale of Two Cities. 2 men at the book's end, one living, one dead. So who stayed alive then, and who lost his head?
The one who died,
Yes.
far, far better than what,
Yes.
was Sidney Carton.
Well done.
And presumably the one who lived was Sidney Box.
I like Evremond.
No, he was a French nobleman,
He
wasn't he?
was, yes.
Of noble
right.
blood. Can't be D'Urd, must be D'Urd.
No, just Evremond.
The Marquis d'Evremond.
That'll do. In The Tale of Two Cities, Sidney Carton was a pretty feckless barrister who found himself in Paris, and he swapped places in prison with Charles Darnay, who was the nephew of Marquis de Saint-Evremond, as you got quite rightly, and he took his place on the scaffold, and the French aristocrat escaped. 3 marks. Dilys Powell, a most unusual book in which the hero should be pitied, for unlike normal heroes, this poor fellow is half-witted. He has a faithful feathered friend, which you may think absurd, but do you know the hero's name and that of his pet bird?
Barnaby Rudge.
And the bird?
Grip
And what was he?
is a raven.
Well done. 3 marks. Denis Norden. 2 famous Dickens characters, one honest and one bent. Jack Dawkins is the name of one, the other is Nell Trent. The books are famous masterpieces everyone should own. What are they, please, and how are these 2 characters better known?
Well, Jack Dawkins is very, very difficult.
Yes.
So I'll leave that one. Nell Trent, I should think, must be Little Nell.
That's right, quite right. And the book?
Old Curiosity Shop.
Yes, that's half the answer.
Dawkins.
He picked pockets.
Oh, yes, he was the Artful Dodger.
Yes.
Yes.
Helped a bit.
Helped a lot, yes.
2 out of 3, I think. And now we come to the last round and go back to those questions I gave the teams earlier in the programme. For 2 marks, Dilys Powell, in which book can you read of Smike, Newman Noggs, and Crummles?
Nicholas Nickleby.
Quite right. 2 marks. Now, Anne Scott James, who wrote, "The best things carried to excess are wrong"?
Was it Gibbon?
That same sort of time. Which century?
18th century, if it's the same sort of time.
That's right. And what might he have been talking about? How about extravagant gestures?
Extravagant gestures, acting,
Yep.
overacting.
Overacting. That's right. 1 out of 2. The best things carried to excess are wrong was written by a poet satirist called Charles Churchill. He lived from 1731 to 1764. And I'm going to ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanation of the answers. And on this occasion, the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer applause from the audience here in the theatre. So, Frank Muir, maintaining our Dickens theme, Nicholas Nickleby.
Every morning, every day, I do a crossword. Never more than 1. Sometimes it's 1 across, sometimes it's 7 across. This morning I chose 1 across. And the most extraordinary thing, that clue gave me the title for this novel I'm writing. I think the novel is going to be rather terrific, but I cannot get a title for it. I've had several goes, but they don't sing. You know what I mean? It starts off, my story, with this group of businessmen who form a sort of sporting club together. There's Sid Pickwick, and he's got his friends there, Scrooge, who's a prosperous grocer, and Scrooge's friend Marley, who's a transparent fraud, but he's always clanking chains, and he opened the first chain store in the city of London. And what they do is they hold little club meetings. They go skating on the ice, and I've got some marvellous descriptive writing. Oh, it was a cold day, the coldest day that you ever did see, or colder than you will ever see, and the ice was glinting. Not just cold ice, but old cold ice and bold cold ice. Can't be told how bold and cold was the ice, and so forth. It's really good stuff. And the club, the Pickwick lot, give all their money to the paupers in the Marshalsea prison. And I was going to call the book The Pickwick Paupers, but I thought, no, it doesn't sing, you know. Then the story moves to the Marshalsea, and we see the prisoners receiving the money from the Pickwick, and there's a chap called Fakin, who with a long nose, who sort of fakes antique furniture for an old curiosity shop. And there's Bob Cratchit, who's a poor clerk who got done for eating his employer's coal. And there's a Magwitch, a long-serving convict who originated the skinhead set. And there's a very poor little boy who sort of shakes when he's spoken to. He's frightened and goes all of a twit. I was going to call my book that, actually. All of a twit, but I thought, no. Doesn't sing. With the money they get from the Pickwick Club, the paupers leave and they go to have their Christmas dinner at Bob Cratchit's house. But there's no goose or anything like that. All they can get is a carrot, which fell off a cart and the horse trod on. I thought of calling the book A Christmas Carrot. No, didn't feel right, but also present there are, at Bob Cratchit's, his little daughter, little Eskimo Nell, who's engaged to a family friend, who's this very pale boy who plays a ukulele called Tiny Tim. They are trying to get married and earning money by being babysitters, which they get 4p a year for that. In those days. As a matter of fact, I thought of calling my book A Tale of Two Sitters. See, it wasn't right, you know. Well, what Oliver, you see, escapes from this, and he escapes to France because of the revolution broken out on the Thursday. And he's wandering around looking at the guillotine and says, "What's that?" you see, and he gets grabbed by the revolting peasants of France. And they say, "We have a cure for people. We can cure people's curiosity from the neck upwards." And they pointed to the guillotine. I'd thought of calling the book The Old Curiosity Chop. But no, it doesn't, it's not right. And then, as I was saying this morning, when I was doing the crossword, and I saw the clue, I mean, there it was. The clue said, Charles Dickens knows what the devil will be when he backs into his own hellfire. Charles Dickens, not the devil, he backs into the... Wait a minute. If old Nick backs into the fires of damnation, what will it be? And so I realised the answer. Nicholas Nickleby.
And now it's Denis Norden's turn, and his quotation has absolutely nothing whatever to do with Charles Dickens. His quotation was, "The best things carried to excess are wrong." Denis.
Well, I got the idea for this from the vogue that there's been in London for foreign restaurants which serve the national dishes of exotic countries. So the big question in the restaurant trade in London recently has been, is there a country which we still haven't built a restaurant round? And I found one. It was while I was in an Arab restaurant, actually, eating couscous and drinking arak, or I might have been eating arak and drinking couscous. It was very dark in there. And the waitress was a Huddersfield lady anyway. But I suddenly thought of a restaurant, of a country for which there was no restaurant, and I resolved to open one. A Tibetan restaurant. I saw it all immediately. And within 3 months, I had the whole thing organised. I got the premises, engaged the staff, had the decorations done, and was stuck for only one thing. The ingredients for the actual Tibetan dishes. Now, I don't know if you know anything very much about Tibetan food. This is definitely a case where ignorance is bliss. I looked it up. I looked all of it up. The favourite Tibetan drink is tea. They drink about 30 or 40 cups of tea a day. They say it keeps them going. It's not ordinary tea. It's tea with salt in it and butter. But it's not ordinary butter. It's yak's butter. And it's not ordinary yak's butter. It's rancid yak's butter. Now, it's no good being insular about this, because there are things to be said for the rancid yak's butter. You can tell it from margarine. You can't tell it from sump oil, but I was going to put it on the menu. It's going to be one of my big attractions, described as the new taste sensation. However, this brought me to the whole nub of my problem with the Tibetan food, and that was that the whole of the Tibetan cuisine depends upon this animal, the yak. And I couldn't open the restaurant until I had the yak. Or not one yak, 2 yaks, actually, because I had to have a lady yak for the dairy produce and a gentleman yak for the meat, you see. So I sent a telegram to Lhasa in Tibet, to a yak herder there, saying, please dispatch 1 lady yak, 1 male yak, Kings Road, Chelsea, soon as possible. And I got a reply saying, yaks dispatched, arriving soon. And there I was, waiting for these things, like a poker player. Before I could open, I had to have 2 yaks or better, you see. And I waited, and waited, and waited for 8 months. You see, what I had forgotten completely was just how ancient were the traditions of the Tibetan yak herders, because they know only one way to dispatch yaks, and that is to herd them, to walk alongside them, which is what this chap did with these 2 yaks from Tibet, up the Himalaya, across Asia, through Europe, and right down the Maidstone bypass. 8 months, and you can imagine when they finally arrived in the King's Road, Chelsea. I mean, you yourself know this axiom about walking making you thin. These yaks were down to the size of a sort of small goat, and they had muscles like iron bands. Now, obviously, I could not serve these as food. So there was only one thing I could do, just put 1 dish on my menu, curried yak. You see, it's the only thing to do to disguise the taste and to hide the scarcity of yak there was actually in the dish, which is what I did on opening night. The only dish was curried yak, and I did that. In fact, I overdid that. I made the curry so strong that half the customers were taken to Chelsea Hospital, and the other half we had to take out in the yard and aim the garden hose down their steaming gullets. Which is why Tibetan food has never really caught on in this metropolis, and I have the restaurant to dispose of if anybody's interested. I would give them, however, this one word of advice about the cooking in future. Tibet's things, curried to excess, are wrong.
By your vote, ladies and gentlemen, Denis Norden wins the contest of the 2 stories, but nevertheless, the entire contest is won by Dilys Powell and Frank Muir. And that brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Anne Scott James, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Anne Scott James, Denis Norden, Dilys Powell, and Frank Muir. Here's round one to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they get the meaning of these words right. We begin with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is or are Anopheles? A-N-O-P-H-E-L-E-S. Anopheles.
They're insects.
Yeah?
They're mosquitoes.
And what do they do?
Well, if they're the wrong kind, they always bite. And if they're the wrong kind, they give you malaria.
Yep, I think that's good enough. 2 marks it is. The word means not beneficial. 2 marks. Denis Norden, what is a medicaster?
Well, it's one of those little wheels on the bottom of a hospital trolley.
Think of poetaster.
Well, a poetaster is a sort of dilettante poet.
Yeah.
And a medicaster would be a sort of dilettante doctor. Yes, he's one of those chaps, you know, who says, oh, well, there's a lot of it about.
I think 1.5 for the help I gave. A medicaster is quite simply a quack. He's somebody who thinks of himself as a doctor and nobody else does. And this bit you add on to the end of medic, aster, means something which expresses contempt, something sham, something would-be. Medicaster. Anne Scott James, what is a baccalaureate?
Oh, it's that mythical examination which is supposed to prove that the young French are so much cleverer than we are.
That's perfectly true, but in general, and apart from the French, you've got to take it on a stage further, haven't you? Baccalaureate.
Oh, have I?
Finish your university courses, no doubt you did with great distinction, Anne. What do you become?
Well, you get a degree. Oh, a BA.
What's that stand for?
Bachelor of Arts.
That's what I wanted. You just get your 2 marks. Anne is quite right. In France, they've dropped it down to the age 18. It's the end examination in the school, and the one that qualifies you for entry to university. 2 marks. Well, Frank Muir, yours is quite different. What is a tucum? T-U-C-U-M. Tucum.
A tucum? Is it one of those games that tucum play? Well, I know, it's points. When a train is going along, normally it goes diddly-dum, 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 diddly-dum. When it comes to points, it goes diddly-dum, diddly-dum, tucum, 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 tucum.
I can't give you any marks at all. A tucum is a Brazilian palm tree.
Of course.
And the fibre of this palm tree is used for ropes and cordage and things like that. Sorry. Before we begin round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down. And I want the 2 women members of the teams to go on studying those quotations, because at the end of the programme, I shall ask them where the quotations come from. Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, your quotation is, "The lady is a tramp." And Anne Scott James and Denis, yours is, "Women and elephants never forget." And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their idea of how these came to be said or written. Well, in this round, the compiler came across the following expressions, which were new to him and maybe new to the teams. Please, can you say what they mean and why? 2 marks each time. Dilys Powell, the phrase "sent up the river."
Sent up the river, it's an American phrase.
Yes.
And it means
Fight
sent to
back.
prison.
Sent to prison.
Sent to prison.
Now why?
Because the prison's up the river.
Up the river.
Sing, sing.
Frank says prison's up the river.
He's absolutely dead right. He's got it
All
completely
boys of my generation know that one.
Well done. Sent to prison, and it comes from the American underworld, And if you were a criminal in New York, it meant you went up the river to Sing Sing prison, which was there. Now, Denis Norden, a jerkwater town. Jerkwater, a jerkwater town.
When that comes from the American overworld, it means a small town.
Yes? And why?
I think it's because one of the great themes or props of the old silent comedies was this thing, which was a town where the trains didn't even stop for water. They sort of took it on by means of a thing that they knocked, and it swung round, and all the silent comedians somehow managed to be on this thing by the water tank which swung round, and Harry Langdon and all of them have done a scene like that.
Yes, thank you, dead right. 2 marks. Jerkwater meant a little village or a little town which had no reason for existence at all, except that it filled up the water tender. 2 marks. Anne Scott James, in a Serbonian bog.
In a Serbonian bog?
Yes.
Oh, it means you are in a mess.
It's actually the B-side of In a Monastery Garden.
In a mess is quite right, Anne, but can you locate this geographically?
Oh, in Russia, I should think. Somewhere in Russia.
No, 1 out of 2. To be in a Serbonian bog means you're in a situation for which escape is difficult or perhaps even impossible, but it was a very treacherous bog which, oddly enough, existed at one time between the delta of the Nile and the Suez Isthmus. So that little bit, which one usually thinks of as being pretty flat and pretty dry. 1 out of 2. Frank Muir, balmy on the crumpet.
Means rather fond of the girls.
No, that won't do.
How do you spell balmy?
B-A-R-M-Y.
It means balmy on the... presumably crumpet is in the sense of head.
Yes.
Balmy on the crumpet just means 18 and fourpence in the pound. It means not quite all there, but doolally.
Yes, that's all right. And why does balmy come to mean that?
Well, because balmy is to do with the making of beer.
Yes.
And balm is the stuff on top of the beer, isn't it?
Yes.
The head, the frothy head. Hence balm aid for the girl who helped her. And it's and balmy in the head means light-headed.
Yes, that's good enough. 2 marks it is. Well, now we have a round of who, why, and what nonsense questions. 2 marks again. Tell us, Powell, whose Aunt Jobiska made him drink lavender water tinged with pink, and why?
I had a very underprivileged childhood, and I never can answer these questions. Sounds like Edward Lear.
Yes, it is.
Edward Lear.
It's a toeless pobble.
Yes.
Is it Toeless Pobble?
Yes, it is the pobble who had no toes, but why was he made to drink this particular thing, lavender water tinged with
Well,
pink?
it would have grown some toes for him.
Yes, will do. 2 marks it is. This comes from the poem The Pobble Who Had No Toes by Edward Lear. For she said, the world in general knows there's nothing so good for a pobble's toes, and so, with luck, his toes would grow again. He was looking for a runcible cat as well, and that's a jolly hard thing to do. Denis Norden, who, according to whom, would call his mother ma'am and bow at her and bob at her, her aged soul to damn?
Gosh.
Oh. No, I don't know.
He keeps a lady in a cage most cruelly all day and makes her count and calls her miss until she fades away.
Yes, that's the grocer. That's
Yes.
G.K. Chesterton's poem.
Yes.
Against rather than to a grocer.
1.5, because a fair amount of help. It's G.K. Chesterton's song against grocers because they weren't good at selling wine in those days. And now to Anne Scott James. What, according to whom, was as white and hairless as an egg?
Somebody's head, I should think.
No, you've got to go lower down than that.
Really? As white and hairless as an egg.
I think I've gone too far, Ben.
I'm sure it's the Arabian Nights Entertainment.
No,
It's a description of somebody's stomach.
Dennis can't go too far on this. Like little mice crept in and out.
Oh, Herrick, that is,
Yes,
isn't it?
Yeah.
yes.
Or it must be calves, knees, feet.
Yes, hello. With whom?
Oh,
Julia?
Yes.
Julia, yes.
Who
disorder.
crept home. My Julia's dainty leg, according to Robert Herrick, the poet, and he wrote this rather nice poem on Julia's legs. Fain would I kiss my Julia's dainty leg, which is as white and hairless as an egg. So there we are. 1 out of 2. Frank Muir, who are being referred to in what poem by whom? Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat, and this was odd because, you know, they hadn't any feet.
French mathematical students.
Explain
Because
that.
they have meters. You see. We think it's Lewis Carroll.
Yes, you're quite right.
Lewis Carroll.
Not the footless man, but the...
Isn't it now?
What didn't
Oh,
he
it's
do?
in the Walrus and the
Yes, that's right.
It's the Walrus and the Carpenter.
Yes.
It can't be
With
either.
the oysters.
Yes.
It's the oysters.
That'll do.
I think, Jack, it's the Walrus and the Carpenter of the Oysters.
All right, 2 marks it is
Feet, isn't it?
in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. Well, in this round, the compiler of this program once again poses his questions in the form of some pretty odd rhymes. For 2 marks, the teams are asked to provide the answers to the questions which he has set in Doggerel. Dilys Powell, I want the name of author and the title of the book. Charles and Mary Lamb wrote tales from Shakespeare, so we're told, to bring the bard's great stories to the not-so-very-old. A similar book on Greek heroic myths still has good sales. An American wrote it, and the title was...
Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yes.
Nathaniel Hawthorne. Tanglewood Tale.
Absolutely right, 2 marks. Denis Norden, I want the name of the father and the son who are concerned in this particular bit. Come fly with me, a man said, long before Sinatra's day. He said it to his son, and so they tried to fly away. They found to fly like birds was not so easy as you'd think. The father was all right, but Sonny finished in the drink.
The son was Icarus.
Yes.
And the father, Frank and I once wrote a sketch on this, and our version was Dead Loss, but the Greek pronunciation is Daedalus.
Yes, quite right. And Scott James, what were they called? They lived upon Mount Pelion, in Thessaly, of course. Their greatest claim to fame was that they were half man, half horse, notorious evil livers, fond of drunkenness and rape. Yet man does just the same today without a change of shape.
Well, they were the centaurs.
Absolutely right, 2 marks. Frank Muir, who was he? He stole the fire from heaven to help us mortals down below, but Father Zeus was very angry when he got to know. He chained the poor chap to a rock, and this'll make you shiver, an eagle came down every day and lunched upon his liver.
Yes, he was a noted early loose liver. It was Prometheus who was bound to the rock, and the liver grew again. That was the ultimate naughtiness, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
It grew again and was picked out. Every night it grew again and was picked out all day.
Yes, absolutely right, 2 marks.
We Frank and I once did a school series, and we used to get letters from school teachers with helpful schoolboy howlers for us to incorporate. I remember one where they'd ask who invented fire, and some kid had written it was the Greek god Promiscuous.
I must tell you another one, too, which came to me recently, where a girl at school had written, it was about Cleopatra, and she said the most famous quotation is, "Age shall not wither her, nor customers stale her infinite variety." Which is very much better.
Well, now we come to the last round, and go back to those quotations I gave the teams earlier in the programme. For 2 marks, Dilys Powell, can you give me the origin of the quotation, "The lady is a tramp"?
It's an American song.
By?
Rodgers and Hart.
Rodgers and Hart?
That'll do.
Resung by Mr. Sinatra.
In Pal Joey.
Yes, well done. Rodgers and Hart wrote the song. It first, I think, appeared in a stage show on Broadway called Babes in Arms, and later many people listened to it in the film Pal Joey. Now, Anne Scott James, the origin of your quotation: women and elephants never forget.
I think it's one of those Edwardian
Yes?
witticisms, and I think it's Sairey.
Absolutely right. Well, now I'm going to ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being. And for this round, the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer applause from the audience here in the theatre. So back to Frank Muir and his quotation, "The lady is a tramp."
If you visit my house, which is quite probable, actually, because I'm throwing it open to the public this summer, £0.50 a head. I'm paying them, actually, but well, it's only because I've laid some new hogging on the drive and it's got to be stamped in. Seems a good way of it. But if you come, you will probably exclaim, as people do exclaim, that whereas the house is in pretty fair nick, I mean, the kitchen is fit for a lady, you can eat your breakfast off the floor, although that very soon will no longer be necessary when the chairs arrive. Whereas the rest of the house is pretty kempt, where we keep the food, the larder is in a terrible mess. Absolutely squalid sort of place. And the reason for that is that my wife wanted this lamp in the drawing room, this spotlight, to do her embroidery by. She's knitting a carpet, well, embroidering a carpet, and it's going to take donkey's years. And she said to me, look, I wish you'd put a spotlight on the ceiling in the drawing room so that I can sew with at night, because it's easy for threading the needle and so forth. So I screwed the spotlight into the drawing room ceiling, which was quite easy to do, and I ran the wire up, and I had to go up into the loft, because, you know, all the wires come together up in the loft, on the floor of the loft. I was wearing a cap, because it's terribly dirty up in a loft, and I was bending over this junction box with a screwdriver, and I gave myself a shock. It wasn't much of a shock, it was just enough to sort of straighten upright suddenly. And I suddenly realised I hadn't got my cap any longer. And I looked around and it was just floating in a tank which supplied the central heating system with water. And the cap was just sinking below the surface like a waterlogged tweed lily. And it was rather a large tank, and I couldn't see how to get it out. And then it was a hot water system, this, incidentally. And about 6 weeks passed, and then the hot water started coming through more slowly. It was rather like sort of drought in the Po Valley. Every day we turned it on, it was down to a trickle. So we called in Ron the plumber, and he hacksawed off a foot of pipe so that he could peer up both ends. And he said, this is all called bunged up, this pipe, it's bunged up. It's all bunged up with sort of rotted, looks like bits of rotted cap. So I said, it wasn't my cap. What had happened is it got right in all the works. He said, you'll have to have a new boiler. So I said, all right. He said, have the oil. So this man came from the oil company in a very good suit, and this beautiful new boiler was fitted, and it does heat up the water most beautifully. Next to the boiler house is the larder. We first noticed this bit of bad planning when I said, why have we got yellow paint running down the side? And we investigated, and it's butter melting. Not only that, the second night, when the heat had really worked its way through the wall, 2 out of a box of British eggs had hatched. So the whole of our larder is a mass of melted butter, eggs hatching, and plaster coming down from the ceilings. Utter chaos. And the reason, as I say, is just because my wife wanted this spotlight to do her sewing by. It's a marvellous story, isn't it? It's even worth making a song of, isn't it? I could say, she doesn't like going early to bed, prefers to sit doing embroidery instead. Just likes a spotlight on a needle and thread. That's why the larder is a dump.
Well, I thought our plumber had nothing to learn, but I know better now. So we go on to Denis Norden and his storyline. If you remember, that is Women and Elephants Never Forget.
This is a party political broadcast. On behalf of any middle-aged party who has a teenage daughter, your government made a monumental boob. They gave that teenage daughter of yours a vote. Now, I'm not against the principle of young ladies having a vote. All I claim is we shouldn't have just given it to them. We should have swapped it. We should have made a deal that said to them, we will give you your vote if you will give us back our telephones. Any parent of a teenage daughter will know that when he comes home at night, there is one certain way of knowing whether his daughter is in the house. You feel the telephone. If it's warm, she's in. Now, with prices of telephone calls going up practically monthly, my friends, you don't know what fear is. To say nothing of the absolute physical, medical risk there is to grown-up males of the middle years who come into their daughter's bedroom and find them holding the telephone over a record player. But Daddy, Anne hasn't heard the new Simon and Garfunkel. You look at the turntable, it's an LP. And the terrible part is, what can you do with this strict enforcement of the law about cruelty to children? What can a man do? There is no more pathetic sight than a middle-aged man trying to think up a threat that could frighten a growing female. You come off that phone. If you don't come off that phone, I'll let down your hemline. What is so inexplicable is that a generation who seem to talk about nothing but their hang-ups are congenitally unable to do so. Now, you may think I'm being alarmist about this, but can I remind you that one of the most rapidly growing revolutionary movements is the movement called the Women's Liberation Committee. The first thing they must do is to seize the lines of communication. I put it to you that their youth branch has already done this. And for the males who are growing up, all I can say, it's a very poor lookout for you, because as Saki foresaw all those years ago, women on telephones never forget.
By your vote, ladies and gentlemen, Denis Norden wins the contest of the two stories, and by half a mark only, he and his partner, Anne Scott James, win the entire My Word contest this evening, and that brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Anne Scott James, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC.
You've been listening to My Word from the BBC, heard each week at this time. This is the WFMT Fine Arts Network.
The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Anne Scott James, Denis Norden, Dilys Powell, and Frank Muir. Here's round one, which tries to test their respective vocabularies. They get 2 marks if they get the meaning of these words, well, fairly roughly right. Anne Scott James, what is suasion?
Well, I should think it's the same thing as persuasion, only an archaic or oldie-worldy form of the same.
It is usually used, particularly in the phrase moral suasion, as opposed to something else.
Immoral.
Physical suasion.
That's right. Exactly what I wanted.
The mental.
Suasion, 2 marks, is persuasion when used as opposed to force. Instead of beating him on the head, you try to persuade him by argument. All right. Frank Muir, what is a sexillion? S-E-X? S-E-X-I-L-L-I-O-N, sexillion.
Well, a sexillion is a number, is it not?
Yes.
It's the it's the number of times the average man has private fantasies during his lifetime.
Yes, that might just about add up, but it doesn't define it accurately.
Well, it's like million and billion and trillion. It's
Yes.
sexillion, 6 to the 6th.
Yes, that's it. All right. Sexillion, which is more dully every now and then called sextillion, is the 6th power of a million, or a million to the 6th. It's 1, followed by 36 ciphers or noughts, which takes you right across the page. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, what is polity? P-O-L-I-T-Y. Polity.
Well, it must be something to do with being a citizen.
It has a connection with that, certainly.
Civilization.
Yes, well, put a "the" in front of it.
The quality of civilization.
Struggle away of the civilization. Doing very well.
I'm giving you,
well.
Dilys, 1 out of 2. It's civil order, or it's the form or process of civil government, but it can simply mean the state, the organized society or the state. So you're slightly off beam.
Yeah,
1 out of 2. Denis Norden, what is a conodal?
Well, it's a sort of grope therapy.
2 marks at once. Unless Denis wants
What
to...
people used to do in the parlour when they had parlours and before they had television.
Yes, Denis.
It's a cuddle,
Yes.
a knibble.
Yes, Denis is quite right. We won't take it any further. 2 marks. Well, before we begin round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team particularly to go on studying those quotations, because at the end of the programme I shall ask them where the quotations come from. Anne Scott James and Denis Norden, your quotation is, "Truth is stranger than fiction," and Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, here's your quotation, "and so to bed." And at the end of the programme, I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their ideas of how these came to be said or written. Round 2 is a quickie round. 2 marks. In which work, by which author, do the following characters appear? Anne Scott James, Edward Bear.
Oh, that must be a nursery book.
Yes?
Is it A.A. Milne? Now, which one? Winnie the Pooh?
Yes. Two marks it is. Frank Muir, Mrs. Hudson.
Is it the Old Testament?
No.
Roderick Hudson, Henry James.
We think, my friend and I think that it's Henry James.
No, it wouldn't be good enough. No? In fact, if you'd noticed where you were about 20 minutes ago, Frank...
The boozer?
You might have been welcomed by her.
Oh, yes, the pub, the bazaar we've just been visiting it's called Sherlock Holmes. There's a clue there, isn't it? So it's a character from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's books. His housekeeper.
All right, that'll do it. Mrs. Hudson was landlady or housekeeper, if you like, to that fictional character, Sherlock Holmes, who lived at 221B Baker Street, which was an equally fictitious place. And she was first mentioned in The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes. Dilys Powell, Corin, a shepherd. C-O-R-I-N. Corin,
Shakespeare?
a shepherd. Yes.
Oh.
One of the plays, I think.
One of the plays, yes. One of the more pastoral plays.
Yes.
Play for time.
The German for it is Was ihr wollt.
What do you want?
As you like it.
All right, well done. Yes, we get 2 marks. Denis Norden, Bathsheba Everdeen.
Does it count if I haven't read the book but I saw the film?
Yes, that's all right.
Far from the madding crowd.
Yes, and who is she?
There was somebody in it called Bathsheba. Was it Julie Christie?
Yes.
Yes. Bathsheba Everdeen was Julie Christie. A treat for all you literary folk.
I'm bound to accept that, even with regret. 2 marks it is. Bathsheba was the central character in Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. 2 marks. All right, the next round. Where did these words come from? 3 marks for defining the present meaning, that's the first job, and then giving me the origin or derivation of the word, and that's the second job. And Scott James, klaxon, K-L-A-X-O-N.
Well, it's a noisy kind of horn, rather useful for using in a motor car.
Yes.
When the man in front of you won't get a move on.
Yes, and how does it come to have that meaning?
Well, it must be a Greek word, possibly.
Yes, it is.
That looks right.
Ariadne of Klaxos.
What? Well, it's a Greek word for a motor horn. Well, it's a Greek word for a noisy sort of noise.
You're right. You're absolutely right. It comes from a Greek word, kladzo, meaning to shriek or make a frightful noise. Frank Muir, corset.
You know that, Jack. Corset is a bag of some fashion from some stout material, reinforced with parts of a filleted whale and bent girders. And its precise function is to contain a lady.
That's a very brilliant description, Frank. I'll give you all 3 marks. Corset, this is a very difficult bit of definition. A woman's closely fitting inner bodice designed to hold in what might otherwise bulge out. And originally, as Frank said, stiffened with whalebone and fastened by lacing stays. And sometimes you use the word stays rather than corset. But it is a diminutive of the old French word corps, C-O-R-S, meaning a body, which is terribly apt because the job of the corset is to make the body as diminutive as you possibly can. So you've got it absolutely right. Dilys Powell, what's the meaning and origin of the word plagiarism?
Plagiarism means to borrow, in a literary sense, from something without acknowledging it.
Yes, that's right. And how does it come to mean that?
Plagio, I please will borrow.
Well, in a sense, this is right, but... But what are you borrowing it for in the original sense?
It's only plagiarism if you borrow from one author. If you borrow from more than one, it's research.
Originally, it meant to kidnap.
Oh. Really?
That's
Never had that.
Meaning the origin is a Latin verb, plagiare, which means to kidnap, and then it meant kidnapping somebody else's thoughts or writings or inventions or words, and hence it meant unfair borrowing without acknowledging the source it comes from. Denis Norden, Sputnik.
That's that thing that whizzes round up in space. It's a satellite.
Whose?
Russians.
Yeah. And what
Comes from a Russian word.
That's right. What's it mean?
Nick is a diminutive of endearment. Sput is anybody's guess.
That's very brave, Dennis. It isn't right, though. 1.5 out of 3. It is a Russian satellite, but it is the Russian, quite simply, for travelling companion. And if you think of the Earth, I mean, this is exactly what a Sputnik is.
That's clever, isn't it?
Now a round of who, why, and what questions. Again, 2 marks. And Scott James, who wrote these words about what? He went back through the wet, wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone, but he never told anybody.
Oscar Wilde.
Is it Kipling? It's Kipling, I should think.
It is Kipling, yes.
And it's the Jusso stories.
And which character?
Got a tail. It must be a monkey, was it?
No.
Which was
Wasn't
it?
the cat that...
The walk by...
Yes.
Walked by itself.
Walked by itself.
Walked alone.
Yes,
Walked
quite right.
alone, yes.
Well done. 2 marks. Frank Muir, who wrote the following words about whom? But first with beef and captain's biscuits and pickled pork they loaded she, but when they got as far as the equator, they'd nothing left but one split pea.
We want to find out who it's about, do we? Is it about some fictitious character that we don't know about?
That's right. Yes, it is.
What, the Gawumble is, or something like that?
Yes, he also wrote about Vanity Fair.
The Thackeray! Actually, my partner didn't mutter Thackeray.
That's a help. You don't remember the name of the poem?
The Rose and the Ring.
No, that's
that's a
same
poem.
kind of thing.
No.
But
The Rose and the Crown.
It's got names like, Emily and Jemima or something.
1 out of 2. There were 3 sailors of Bristol City who took a boat and went to sea, but first with beef and captain's biscuits and pickled pork they loaded she. When they got as far as the equator, they'd nothing left but one split pea.
Well, they hadn't taken a split pea.
Mainly because they got 2 characters aboard called Gorging Jack and Guzzling Jimmy, and the youngest, he was Little Billy. And it's a poem called Little Billy, and he was in very grave danger of being eaten by the other 2 famished characters until Admiral Napier, KCB, with the whole of the home fleet hove in sight. 1 out of 2, I think. Dilys Powell, who wrote these lines about whom? The maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, do you remember the girl's name?
Annabel Lee.
Well done. Yes, you get 2 marks.
Who's wonderful?
Denis Norden, who said this about the title character of his book, and who was she? On a desert island, she would have spent most of her time in looking for a man's footprint.
I'm not going to mess about. I don't know.
Moll Flanders, could it be?
Later, much later.
Oh.
And on her behalf, most of the blue-blooded of Oxford drowned.
Zuleika Dobson.
Author?
Max Beerbohm. He also said about her that the inanimate had little charm for her.
Yes, that's right. 1.5, certainly, because I did help. Well, now we come to the last round, and we go back to those quotations I gave the 2 teams earlier in the programme. 2 marks, and Scott James, can you give me the origin of the quotation, truth is stranger than fiction?
I think it's a time-honoured proverb, Jack.
It doesn't seem awfully honoured by time. We've tried to look it up.
Can you give me a hint? One of those
Oh, yes.
feeble hints.
You can go to Greece as often as you like.
Oh, yes. It's Don Juan.
Well done. Well, now, Dilys Powell, I'd like the origin of your quotation, and so to bed.
Samuel Pepys, I think.
I won't ask you which particular night.
Every night.
Yes, that's all right. 2
Never
marks.
on a Sunday.
And now I'm going to ask Denis and Frank to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being, And for this round, the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer applause from the audience here in the theatre. So back to Denis Norden and his Truth is Stranger Than Fiction.
Someone, somewhere, should write a book on how to cope with being a father. I thought of doing it myself, actually, but I couldn't think of a title. Pop art. Possibly. But it is true that the very fact of being a father seems to warp every one of your reasoning processes. And it starts right from the very first moments of being a father. Before you've actually got the child, people come up to you and say, what do you want it to be, a boy or a girl? And you say, as long as it's healthy, I don't care what it is. Now that is about as lunatic a statement as it's possible. I mean, imagine the scene if the doctor came out of the delivery room with the bundle and said, congratulations, it's a lovely baby, but I don't know what it is. You see, there is something about having a child that does seem to scramble a man's reasoning capacity. In fact, if you listen to yourself talking to one of your children, you can actually hear yourself going out of your head. I don't mind you making a noise, but do it quietly. Or, all right, climb the tree. But if you break a leg, don't come running to me. You see, the whole process of being a father sets up situations which the human mind cannot cope with, was never supposed to cope with. And they tell you things about it which are so manifestly untrue. Children should be seen and not heard. You gaze at your teenage son. Hip-length hair and one earring. Who says they should even be seen? You wonder if you should do what they say you should do, have a man-to-man talk with him. A man-to-it talk. About what? Think. About the dangers facing the young people of today. What dangers? The word pot goes through your mind. You consider how it's changed, the word pot, from something you tried to put it on to something you tried to keep him off. But before you can even venture a word about it, he picks up his guitar and leaves for tonight's protest sit-in. As he goes through the door, in a last despairing effort, you call out after him, "Have a good time, son." He actually comes back into the room. "Dad, don't tell me how to live my life." But there's no doubt about it. I have to write that book if I can only find a title. Somebody's already written one called Mother Courage. Father Courage. No. How about Mr. Portnoy's Complaint? No, I think one could keep it simple. Youth is stranger than fiction.
All be eternally grateful to Denis for his memorable definition of the differing generational meanings of pot. I think we should remember that for always. Well, we go on to the second quotation, and Frank Muir's, if you remember, was "and so to bed."
Absolutely everything there is to know about picnics, an authoritative lecture. Now, in England, we require 4 things for a picnic. We require sunshine, we require grass, we require something to sit on, a stone, a log, a poor relation, and we require one other element. And it's this other element which I'm rather interested in, because the basis of an English picnic is the sandwich. And the basis of sandwich is bread. Now, the trouble is that something has overtaken the sandwich since those days. In fact, over the last 10 years, the sandwich has changed, not only in this country, but through the world. In France, they've elongated it. A sandwich is now 1/2 metre in length and doesn't count unless the meat is overlapping and flapping out of the sides of it. In Scandinavian countries, they've taken the lid off. There's only a bottom to it. There's no top to the sandwich, which is completely unnatural. In this country, British Railways have invented the curved sandwich. But the genuine British sandwich, which takes 2 hands to hold the contents in, has now gone because of the bread involved, because bread, as you know, is no longer made in this country, and we now have slices of white polythene foam. The trouble is with white polythene foam is that everything within it tastes the same. So the good old standbys of a British picnic, like marmalade and banana sandwich or cheese and tomato, all taste the same. You just get a soggy mess like wet face tissues to eat. Now, I was going on a picnic recently, and I decided to make my own bread. There wasn't time. But somebody thrust into my hand a new sort of bread, new to me, which is the Irish soda loaf, where you use not yeast at all, but bicarbonate of soda. And you can make the whole thing in 10 minutes. So I knocked up a batch, shoved it in the oven. 10 minutes later, into the boot it went. A magnificent, huge, cushion, enormous brown cowpat of a loaf. When we arrived at our chosen spot, sunshine, grass, we lifted this thing out and were almost ruptured. It weighed about 100 weight. I plunged a knife into it and the blade fractured. I had to, was it Aeschylus who dropped a tortoise from a great height to break it? Well, I had to climb a cliff and drop this damn Irish soda thing to fracture it. But then, what a discovery. We were on a steep hill by the grass. The handbrake was a bit dodgy, so I shoved a wedge-shaped piece of the loaf under the rear tyre, and the car was held firm. As usual, we'd forgotten the opener for the beer. A jagged piece of the loaf, just a slight jab. The tin immediately opened. Another rather more jagged piece opened the top of the beer bottles in a flash. Ants were the trouble. Thump the earth with a piece of the soda loaf. Insects can't stand vibration. Away they went. The perfect picnic. And at the end, we collected all the debris, rolled it in a piece of paper, put the remnants of this granite-like substance into the paper and chucked it into the water, and it sank forevermore. So there, I believe, is the 4th ingredient of a perfect picnic. So if you want the 4 ingredients of the perfect picnic, it is sunshine, grass, somewhere to sit, and as Pepys said, and soda bread.
Well, by your vote, ladies and gentlemen, in the contest of the 2 stories, Frank Muir wins, but nevertheless, in this entire contest of my word this evening, this is won by Denis Norden and Anne Scott James, and that brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Anne Scott James, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC.
You've been listening to My Word from the BBC, heard each week at this time. This is the WFMT Fine Arts Network.
The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words. Those taking part are Dilys Powell, Frank Muir, Anne Scott James, and Denis Norden. And here's round one to try and test their respective vocabularies. 2 marks if they get the meaning of these words right. We begin with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what's the meaning of glabrous?
Glabrous is a word often used in books about botany.
Yes?
And it is generally applied to a leaf, which is rather sort of shiny.
What's it lack?
It's very smooth.
Yes, I think that'll do. Glabrous means free from hair, free from down. It can be used for either botany or animals or chaps. It can mean bald, if you prefer it. And it does come from a Latin word, glaber, just meaning that. Now, Denis Norden. Denis, what is natation? N-A-T-A-T-I-O-N, natation.
Well, I tell you how I happen to know this word. No, really. Quite a few years ago, I went on holiday to a little fishing village in Normandy called Cabourg, who were just sort of entering the tourist stakes at that time, and they published a brochure which had been written in English by somebody I don't think actually had ever spoken English. We got it all from a dictionary, and they promised on the brochure, as one of the delights of Cabourg, that there would be daily exhibitions of hippic natation. Now, I looked it all up. Exhibitions I knew. Natation is to do with swimming, but hippic is to do with horses. And we were trying to work out why would it be daily exhibitions of horses swimming. And we thought maybe they'd looked up water polo. Hadn't quite, but as it rained all the time anyway, it didn't really make any much difference. But natation is swimming. That's the longest answer you've ever got.
Oh, very nice one, Dennis. You're quite right. Natation is swimming. It can, I think, be floating, which is sort of staying in the same place but on top of the water. Anne Scott James, what are delphinoids? D-E-L-P-H-I-N-O-I-D-S, delphinoids.
They could be something to do with dolphins.
That'd be exactly it. And what
dolphin-type animals.
That'll do. That's absolutely splendid. Delphinoids, members of the family, which includes dolphins, porpoises, grampuses, and so on, which are warm-blooded, free-swimming mammals in the water. 2 marks. Frank Muir, what is a tune?
Tune. It's what American songs occasionally contain. Or it could be a place in Scotland larger than a village but smaller than a city.
Tree.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a tree.
And what would you use it for?
Use it for cutting down.
I think 1.5.
Furniture.
Yes,
Furniture
that's
wood.
what I wanted.
Furniture wood from Burma. Teak.
Tune is an East Indian tree with very closely grained redwood, very much used for furniture, sometimes called Indian mahogany. And the catch was that it's very much like the Scottish word for tongue. 1.5.
It's not made. Furniture isn't made of wood nowadays. You get a little thin skin or dermis of wood.
Or cutis.
Or cutis on a large slab of solid porridge.
I get awfully mixed. I thought cuties were what we put on it, but I maybe wrote wrong. Well, before we begin round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to go on studying those quotations, because at the end of the programme, I shall ask them where the quotations come from. And Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, your quotation is, "O mistress mine, where are you roaming?" And Anne Scott James and Denis Norden, yours is, "He travels the fastest who travels alone." And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their ideas of how these really came to be said or written. And so on to round 2. Owing to pretty long association, certain proper names and place names have come to mean individual things. For instance, Sandwich, which comes from the Earl of Sandwich, and Cardigan, which came from Lord Cardigan. For 2 marks, with what do you associate the following and why? Dilys Powell, a raglan.
A raglan is
Something
an
you eat.
overcoat.
A particular kind of overcoat.
An overcoat in which it doesn't hang very well because there's not much of a seam up here where the sleeve. The
That's
sleeve
right.
is all cut in one bit
That's quite right.
with the rest of it.
And who...
Like a bat.
Lord Raglan.
And what was he, do you remember?
He was mixed up with the Crimean War.
Very much so, yes. All right, 2 marks. A raglan is an overcoat without any shoulder seams at all. The sleeve runs right up to the neck, which, as Dilys says, is pretty inconvenient. And it comes from Lord Raglan, who was our commander-in-chief in the Crimean War. Denis Norden, Angostura.
It's a very bitter drink, which they lifted. It comes from the West Indies somewhere because some member of Parliament was sort of campaigning on behalf of lifting the import duty off Angostura, which is going to help the economy.
You're doing jolly well. And do you know what, in fact, it comes from, in order that you may make it? It's a little like quinine.
Yes, I think it comes from a tree.
That's right. That'll do.
Furniture tree.
2 marks. Yes, it recalls Angostura bitters, or pink gin, or gin and Angostura bitters. It was a bark of a tree from which you distilled something, which was used as a tonic and a cooling drink to reduce fever, febrifuge. And it came from Angostura, which is a town on the Orinoco in Venezuela, which has now been renamed, and I find it very hard to pronounce, Ciudad Bolivar, been named after the liberator of those parts of the world. 2 marks. Anne Scott James, Mechlin, Mechlin, Mechlin.
What are you asking me about Mechlin?
Well, I want to know what it is and how it comes to be called that.
Don't know neither. Sounds like a battle. Do you think there was a battle of Mechlin?
There may well have been, but this isn't what I want.
Oh, then it's a place.
It is a place, yes.
Right.
In either Holland, Belgium, Germany, or around about.
All right, you've bracketed the target.
That's right. Right. Somewhere in the
Well,
middle
what's made there?
It's a Netherland-type place.
No?
I should think something of a textile-ish
Yes,
nature
it is.
then.
Quite right.
Now it's either lace.
Yes, that'll do. All right. You've fought your way home, Anne. Well done. Mechlin is lace. It was a name given to the beautiful pillow lace made at Mechlin, which is now called Mechelen or Malines in Belgium. 2 marks. Frank Muir, Berlin.
It was a many-coloured wool.
Oh, quite right.
Berlin wool.
That's one of the things, yes?
No, I'm right. I wouldn't...
Yes, but I
fob
didn't
you
say
off.
Berlin wool. I said a Berlin without the wool.
Well, it's a garment made from Berlin wool, like a muffler.
No, or
After Lord Muffler, there was It's what? Cabbage?
Carriage.
Oh, I put my glasses on.
Yes, that's right.
It's that's better, yes. Oh, yes, it's carriage. It's a Victorian carriage.
how many wheels?
What?
How many wheels?
None.
Well, it
None.
depends. It's 4.
Very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Isn't it one of those with sort of... I can see one with a kind of umbrella of black oilskin.
That's right. Well done. Yes, absolutely right. 2 marks. Get it straight away. Oh, not straight away. Get it. A 4-wheeled covered carriage with a hooded seat behind, which is very kind because that was probably where you put the coachman, I suppose. Invented in Berlin in the 17th century, but became very popular in England and France during the 18th century. But Frank was also right because a Berlin warehouse was a shop where they sold Berlin wool, which is a very fine kind of dyed, many-coloured knitting wool. Berlin gloves are knitted gloves. 2 marks. Well, now a round of origins and derivations, and in these particular questions I'm going to ask you to explain, first of all, the current meaning of the word, and then how it originated. Again, 3 marks possible. Dilys Powell, to pit one's wits or to pit one's strength against someone else.
Well, it means to engage in a kind of combat and hope to do well.
Yes, and it comes from what?
Pit one's strength. I think it comes from boxing.
No.
No? Bear baiting.
You're getting nearer.
Bear baiting.
Cockfighting.
Yeah.
Cockpit.
Yeah.
And what's it mean there?
To put him in the ring.
In that
That's it.
nasty ring. Disgusting. Horrible.
3 marks it is. Pitting our wits or pitting our strength or pitting yourself against heavy odds, all these phrases, meaning to match yourself with strength or sometimes with wit against an adversary. And it comes directly from the cockpit in which fighting cocks used to fight, where 2 birds were matched against each other. Or it could be dogs, because they had, in those unregenerate times, dog fights in pits, 1 dog against another. 3 marks. Denis Norden, pamphlet, just like pamphlet.
Well, it's a piece of paper that's thrust into your hand as you walk down Oxford Street. That's the present-day meaning. Mm-hmm. It sounds Greek. Yes, it used to be pamphlos, a Greek word meaning a piece of paper which is thrust in your hand while you walk down High Street, Athens.
Don't you think? I think it was a papyrus town in Egypt. How about that?
I think I'll only give you 1 out of 3. A pamphlet is a small book of a few sheets, usually unbound and just stitched together, usually on some subject of controversial and only occasional and immediate interest. I mean, it hasn't got any long run, usually. And curious enough, it comes from an old French word, pamphile, and it was the name of a 12th century, an extremely erotic Latin poem, which became very popular and was passed rather under the counter from hand to hand in this particular way. 1 out of 3. Anne Scott James, martinet.
Well, it means somebody who is very bossy and a bit of a dragon.
Yes.
Sort of army colonels or brigadiers or generals wrapped up in martinet.
Meaning pretty accurate.
Oh, yes, exactly. Well, in the army in the 18th century, around 1760, there was a particularly unattractive lance corporal or major called martinet.
Cross the channel and go back.
Yes, called Martinet. We mean Monsieur le Maréchal Martinet or Lance.
Do you remember who he worked for? Push it back 1 century from what you did.
Yes, 17th century France. There was a lance corporal called Caporal Martinet.
All right, no, look here, 2 marks. Martinet, it means a strict and rigid disciplinarian, and as Anne quite rightly said, it's normally used for military and naval ranks of different sort of levels. But there was a Marquis de Martinet, who was a colonel who commanded Louis XIV's own regiment of infantry. And the particular thing about that regiment was that while Louis XIV was around, he made all young noblemen command a platoon in this unit, and they had a frightful time before they did what they normally went on to do, which is to buy a command in an infantry regiment. 2 out of 3. Frank Muir, what is a lich gate and why so called? It can be L-Y-C-H or it can be L-I-C-H.
It's the gate in front of old churches, which has a little roof on it.
Yes.
Lich is a German for corpse.
That's the bit I wanted, yep.
Yes.
Lich gate is the roofed or covered gateway at the entrance to a churchyard, and it is this word both in Old German, and in present German and in Old English, Leiche or Leich, which means a corpse. And at that particular point of entry into the churchyard and under the protecting roof, the coffin bearers would stop for a bit while waiting for the priest or clergyman to come on and do the service. 3 marks. Now around about fictional detectives. For 2 marks, I want to know who created the following. Dilys Powell, Chief Detective Inspector Roderick Allen, and it's spelled A-L-L-E-Y-N.
Marjorie Allingham. Is that right? No, wasn't it?
No, it's, and don't try to spell it.
No, right.
Niall Marsh. Yes.
Absolutely right.
Thank you, dear.
Very famous woman writer of detective stories, Niall Marsh. I can't pronounce her name any better than Frank's very gallant attempt. 2 marks. Denis Norden, Nero Wolfe.
The author is Rex Stout.
Well done. 2 marks it is. Anne Scott James, Lord Peter Wimsey.
Dorothy Sayers.
2 marks again. Frank Muir, Mr. Fortune, or perhaps Reginald Fortune to you.
Reggie Fortune. H.C. Bailey.
Absolutely right.
Yep.
H.C. Bailey wrote detective stories in which Mr. Fortune was the detective hero. A quick round, well done. Now we come to the last round, and go back to those quotations I gave the two teams earlier on in the programme. For 2 marks, Dilys Powell, can you give the origin of the quotation, "Oh, mistress mine, where are you roaming"?
It's a Shakespearean song. "Oh, mistress mine, where are you, Romeo? Stand here, your true love's coming, that can sing both high and low."
Absolutely right. It's the clown's song in Act 2 of Twelfth Night. 2 marks. Now, Anne Scott James, I'd like the origin of your quotation. "He travels the fastest who travels alone."
I think it's Rudyard Kipling.
Yes?
That's
Absolutely
pretty
right. Yeah. That'll do. Yes, 2 marks. And I'm going to ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanations of how these quotations came into being. And for this round, the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer applause from the audience here in the theatre. So back to Frank Muir and to his quotation, "Oh, mistress mine, where are you roaming?"
It was a very cold winter, last winter, in our part of the country, and I had found a way of keeping warm in bed. My feet, I suffer from cold feet, you know. I lose all sense of feeling in my toes. They go into a sort of coma. And I'm lying there, comatose, the whole evening. And my wife wanted to buy an electric blanket. And I said, "Extravagance, woman. Extravagance. I'll warm the bed if such is needed. I'll just use simple materials and put a bit of thought into it." So I devised a system of warming it by hot water. And what I did was, I got the garden hose, which is 100 foot of it, and put it on the hot tap, one end of it on the hot tap, and then wound the hose round and round the bed. And the spare I then put in the end into the bath and turned the hot tap on, and we both went to bed. Perfect, absolutely perfect. No, it wasn't absolutely perfect. There was a snag in it. The snag was that it got terribly hot for the first part of the night, and then got terribly cold because I used up all the hot water in the hot water tank. And then it went cold and sort of ran round us cold. And also I left the plug in the bath. And new ceilings aren't all that expensive, funnily enough. They just plaster the little bit that's got wet. I realised that wouldn't work. And then one morning in the garden, I realised the answer was nature's way. My wife suddenly said, "Look, what I'm building there is a hotbed. And on that I go, hotbed? Of course." So I rushed out with the lining of the mattress, filled it up with horse manure, which I hadn't got much of, grass clippings, little bit of loam, packed it all tight, rushed it in. It's absolutely marvellous. It's a bit bobbly, you know, because there are a few bricks in and broken tiles, but in a couple of nights, the warmth, the whole thing was suppurating underneath, and the warmth in this was about 110 degrees, and it cost nothing. Absolutely well, it wasn't quite perfect, because the smell was a bit intolerable. Well, we used to bath in eau de cologne. It wasn't too bad. I thought it was a marvellous idea, but after about a fortnight of this, and people had stopped coming to us, and the midges round the house were like a black cloud day and night. And I came home one evening, and my wife was looking rather guilty and was rather flecked. And I said, "What have you been doing?" She said, "I've been burning something in the garden, but don't worry." And I said, "Ah." And she said, "By the way, I bought an electric blanket." So I said, "What's happened to our hotbed mattress? Nature's answer." And she said, "Thieves came and stole it." So I said, "What thieves?" "Well, let us tell the gendarmerie. I mean, what do they look like?" She said, "Chinese. One was a Chinaman, and the other one was a Russian, and the other was an Indian. So we'll never catch them. So forget it." So there we are. I've got the electric blanket. It gives a beautiful warmth, but I often think of my little mattress and whether it's warming Russian up on the steps or whether go by desert, there's a little Chinaman enjoying himself on it, or whether there's an Indian up the Hindu Kush. And although I'm happy now, I still feel a little wistful, and I think to myself, really in the words of Shakespeare, "Oh, mattress mine, where are you warming?"
Well, whatever you may think about life with Frank, it's certainly rarely dull. And we now pass on to Denis Norden and his quotation. He travels the fastest who travels alone.
Frank's tribulations with the rubber hose and his sad sense of loss with the hotbed are but two of the occupational hazards of gardening. Gardening is a painstaking operation, especially in the small of the back. That was one of the conclusions I came to some weeks ago when I was sitting outside reading some science fiction, or as they're sometimes known, seed catalogues. Now, I have a theory about these. You know those coloured photographs they put on the outside of seed packets? It has long been my contention that those are posed by professional flowers. You know, at 2 guineas an hour. Because none of them bear any resemblance at all to the gaunt grey objects which emerge from my soil. That's when anything emerges at all. Because where nature is concerned, I don't plant flowers. I bury seeds. Now, I do believe that there is an insanity to gardening, and nowhere is it more marked than in the tending of front lawns. In the first place, there's the expense. The money that my mangy square of brown straw has cost me, it would have been cheaper to have the whole area carpeted. What with the mulch, the nutrients. Not only is that lawn better dressed than I am, there's the expenditure of time that it involves. I don't know if you know one particular fertilizer which urges you to apply it every 6 hours. Now, really, honestly, I know there are keen gardeners among you, but is there any human activity more ridiculous than getting up in the middle of the night to give a patch of grass its 2 o'clock feed? There comes a time when reason rebels against this, as mine did. And this summer, surveying that pockmarked square, I came to my senses. No more sweating and striving over this. Let technology take over. And forthwith, I covered the whole of the front lawn with a scientific substance that is guaranteed to repel every known form of weed and pest. It's called cement. My next-door neighbour was appalled. "What are you going to plant in that?" he said. I answered him in 2 hyphenated words. Petrol pumps. My friends, let me recommend them to you for your spring show. They make a brave splash of colour. And this evening, as I lay in my deck chair, listening to the cheerful gush of 99 octane and the gay clink of coins changing hands, I surveyed the pile of sand and gravel and water and the bucket and spade, and I thought to myself how speedily this horticultural miracle had been established. And I remembered the old gardening adage, which is surely truer now than it ever was: he gravels fastest who gravels a lawn.
And the vote goes to Denis for his story, but nevertheless, Frank Muir and Dilys Powell win the entire contest by only 1.5 marks.
My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Anne Scott James, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC.